My name is Mona Yakubian. I'm the Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's my great pleasure to welcome those of you in the room as well as those joining us online for this fireside chat on navigating humanitarian assistance in Gaza. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Institute of Peace, we are a national, independent, nonpartisan institute created by Congress. Our mission is the prevention, mitigation, and resolution of violent conflict around the world. As we think about conflict, I think our minds turn very quickly to Gaza, to the conflict in Gaza, which has presented an extraordinarily complex set of humanitarian challenges. Since the war began on October 7th with the Hamas attack, and then of course the ensuing conflict in Gaza, we have seen humanitarian conditions deteriorate to really extraordinary crisis levels. There are now concerns about imminent famine in northern Gaza. There are an estimated 129 hostages from several countries who remain unaccounted for, also in Gaza. And looming over all of this is a potential incursion into Rafa in the southern part of Gaza. I'm honored to welcome Ms. Sigrid Kaag to help us unpack the complexity of the humanitarian challenges in Gaza. Ms. Kaag serves as the United Nations Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. This is a position she has held since January, following the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2720 last December. In this role, she facilitates, coordinates, monitors, and verifies humanitarian relief consignments into Gaza. Ms. Kaag brings a wealth of experience to this job. She's held several positions in the Dutch government, most recently serving as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. She also has a wide range of senior positions in the UN. She served, among other places, as UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon from 2015 to 2017. Before we engage in our discussion, I want to make sure the audience knows that you will have the ability to pose questions. You should have question cards with you that will be collected. Or yes, Robert in the back has question cards. Just signal and we'll make sure you get one. Those who are joining us online, you can use the chat box to pose your questions. We want to make sure we have time for that at the very end. So with that, Sigrid, let me dive right in. The situation in Gaza was already quite dire in December when the UN Security Council resolution passed creating your position. Since then, as I've noted, several UN agencies are warning about the prospect of imminent famine. Can you describe for us the scope and the scale of humanitarian needs in Gaza? And more broadly, how would you frame the overarching problem set of the humanitarian challenges that are posed in the Gaza conflict arena?
Thank you. Well, the first one is hard to summarize, but I would start to say the situation is catastrophic. All civilians are deeply affected. Majority have lost their homes, certainly lost their livelihoods. We have thousands and thousands of children in modern wartime, and I cite this very carefully, without a known living relative. Now, Gaza families have always been extended. Gaza families tend to have quite a number of children. But without a known living relative is very telling about the extent of the loss of lives. You know the statistics that 2/3 of the casualties in this conflict are women and children. There's no clean water, or very little. People are reduced to sharing, hundreds of them, a latrine. This also has a corollary effect that women and girls are not particularly safe to use whatever is one would call facilities. I mean, these are not facilities. It is for communal use at best, if you're lucky to have it. Waste is lying in the streets, piling up. I'm still surprised you don't see rats, or not as many as one would expect. Anecdotally, I'm told no, because rats also get eaten. So everything tells you, every example tells you how dire it is. Actually, the word dire I don't think is applicable. In a place, of course, where you're confined, no place to flee, and movements within, internal displacement within in Gaza have been compounded. So extent and scale, I mean, I've said this a number of times on other occasions. I've been going to Gaza for different professional reasons since 1988. And you cannot recognize the place. I also know Palestinians from Gaza who try to desperately look up on the map to see if they can find some sort of markers to see where their house was, because let's say the mosque is destroyed and the houses are around it, so you don't have the classic, you turn around the corner, then there's that church maybe, or there's that school, and I'll find out where my house was, because everything is gone in certain areas or reduced to significant amounts of rubble. Where to start, how to keep going, how to retain a measure of human dignity is, I think, a task for all of us. So it's catastrophic, it's very daunting, and significantly more needs to be done.
So on that point, and earlier this week, the Biden administration did note that Israel has taken, in, quote, significant steps to improve the flow of aid to Gaza, but also stressed that there is significant more work to be done, I think, to the point that you're just making. Are you seeing any improvements on the ground? And how would one measure improvement, given what you've just laid down? How do we understand what the metrics are for any improved situation on the ground in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, I believe you're referring to David Satterfield as well.
Yes, correct.
I think he gave
That's right.
sort of an exit interview, perhaps.
Exactly. Now former. Now former.
And he's done a formidable job, of course, from day one. He's been out there bringing and pushing and asking and checking. I definitely, I've said this yesterday to the Security Council as well, since the 5th of April, in the wake of the tragedy which led to the death of the WCK humanitarian workers, Israel has taken a number of steps, has made a number of commitments. So I think we have to recognize that. It was, of course, a period on in the conflict, but we need a lot more. And I've been also very clear on that to the Security Council. We need a paradigm shift. And that means we need to see a significant increase in volume. We need sustainable and consistent flows. We need to see measures still being implemented or that will be implemented, which I know Israeli officials have confirmed they will do, that can definitely alter the way in which we can actually receive and distribute the assistance. Because maybe in the months when supplies were only sort of coming in as sort of more by a trickle effect, or it was way below anything we would expect for effective humanitarian assistance, we've all started counting trucks. But trucks is the wrong metric. It's a means to an end. It's a vehicle. Fine, you need it to move around. But it tells you very little on the quantity of the supplies, the relevance, the types of goods that you need to not only sustain a population, but deal, for instance, with malnourished children, to provide the right therapeutic feeding, to give the dignity kits to women and girls, to have the right type of medication for trauma care, but also chronic health care. So it's a broad scope of needs, and for that we need to see a change, not only on the supply side, but also in our ability to deliver, and then it gets very granular and very practical. It gets to road repairs. There's often then, it's sometimes said, well, the UN is not coming to pick it up. Sometimes it's quite difficult because the trucks can't go. Until recently, and the Israeli government has now made a decision to expand the fuel supply, it was just simply not enough fuel for trucks or cars to go, or our vehicles. The clearance of drivers or convoys, behavior at checkpoints inside Gaza. There's a lot of improvement that still needs to be made, and clear sort of agreements to be firmly established or reaffirmed. And that's what we also qualify as the paradigm shift. All that underpins the collective ability of the UN. But let's not forget the international NGOs, as well as the Palestinian NGOs, Palestine Red Crescent in particular, It underpins our collective ability to expand our footprint and above all, reach people on a constant and a consistent basis. Now, the WCK case, of course, the tragic incident has also shown that deconfliction, a much touted word, needs to be very clearly understood but also adhered to. Yeah. What does it mean? From A to Z, when a humanitarian convoy has the agreement to go, what happens underway, if there is a risk of an incident, that we have direct contact to the military authorities, I would say, with the IDF, that we can prevent, and all this is still a constant negotiation or a dialogue, I would say, and I expect additional measures to be made or announced, and also really to be firmed up. At the end of the day, the only metric then is if the well-being of people is improving, if we can treat malnourished children, if we're bringing people back from the brink, if there is sufficient shelter, if access to clean water is improved. And I'm working on a measurement system basically with the UK, but also I just came this morning afternoon, a meeting at the NSC, and the US has also committed to assist us to make sure that we all have the right metric. Otherwise we go from we can't move from the anecdotal into the measurable. And you know, as we know, data and our ability to measure is extremely important, because it also makes it, I would say, it makes it almost less political and makes it even more practical. We don't have to argue. If we are firm in the data, the ask is also very clear, and the accountability is also an important factor in this.
It's very helpful, and I think I would really like to draw you out further on different aspects of this kind of paradigm shift that you're talking about. But I want to start by having you articulate in more detail the particular vulnerability that women and children face. And of course, you've worked in other conflict zones. We see this across the globe in various conflict zones. We've seen it certainly in the Gaza conflict. You noted already the number of children, not just orphaned, but I think with no living relatives, which is pretty devastating. The number of widows, and now so women-headed households, which also conveys its own set of challenges. But maybe could you articulate a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more on the nature of, or the sort of the disproportionate challenge that women and children in particular face in a conflict zone such as the one in Gaza?
Yeah, obviously I'd have to say that the conflict zone that Gaza is, given the perimeters and parameters of the conflict, there's no other situation like this. Gaza is a conservative society, it was, but all girls, women and girls, went to school and completed their education. So I think vulnerability has many faces. It's the acute, it's the now, it is the more marginal position they may have within their family, household or community. The fact that a lot of the men are either out there looking for food or barter or queuing up. The girls are often sent to look for water and other food commodities. You see the streets filled with children, you see it also in the pictures often, with these baskets or anything to try to gather some foodstuffs in or water. I hear also from my colleagues on the ground in Gaza that they are deeply concerned about the rise of gender-based violence. Should we be surprised? Sadly, no. But it's a given. And when people are ultimately deeply poor and dependent solely on very low levels of assistance, certainly till now, the risk of exploitation in any other form are very real. And I got a debrief from my colleague of a number of the conversations he's had. This is something we also need to home in on. Equally so at night, given that there's electricity is hardly available, it's not a safe place for women and girls to go and use and try to queue up for that latrine. Nightfall is a very dangerous place in these types of settings for women and girls. But I would also argue for the many unaccompanied children that Gaza counts. How would I describe it? That's the current. The vulnerability, to my mind, also lies now in the deep poverty and the total exposure and lack of safe shelter or any opportunities. How do you get children and girls back into places of learning? Usually we see that if a family is deeply is deeply impoverished and has no opportunity is not the girls that will be continuing their education. So there are also risks to their future development, even if we are in a stage again where perhaps early recovery may have taken place and educational opportunities are opening up, even in the most hopefully creative and innovative forms. We have to push here also for the fact that rights are equal, but vulnerabilities are not equal. There's an inequity built in, and that's something I think we have to also anticipate from now.
It sounds like with a magnitude that lasts over a generation. I mean, these are not changes that are just addressed in the immediate term.
Yeah.
So some of what you were saying leads me to want to also have you help us understand better the threat of what we've already seen, the breakdown of law and order in northern Gaza for sure, and I don't know how the situation is further south, but some of the chaos that erupts as a result of security vacuums and governance vacuums. And I think I read somewhere something you said, which I thought was fascinating. It makes sense, unfortunately, which is the scarcity of food itself becomes a driver for conflict. And so I wonder if you could kind of explain to us, help us understand better this non-permissive environment in which these challenges are taking place. How do we understand the role of the breakdown of law and order? What kinds of additional challenges does that present to your team and others that are working this issue?
Yeah, well, the breakdown of law and order, of course, in the absence of sort of the de facto authority, so to speak, the security that was earlier on, I would say, provided / imposed by Hamas, but there was a functioning police force for better or for worse. I mean, I'm not going to caveat that further. I think we'll understand what we're talking about, has led to this vacuum. Now, in nature, a vacuum always gets filled, but not necessarily by the forces for good. Despair has crowded out any ability to organize. Despair has upped prices for scarce commodities, certainly before the measures of the 5th of April were taken, when there was an attempt at least to sort of certainly increase the levels of assistance. We've seen a drop in the prices for certain commodities the moment supplies were a little bit more available or the volume was out there on the market. So that had a sort of restorative aspect partially. And then, of course, the many months where there was hardly anything coming in or far from a level of sufficiency, we've seen the crowds. People had this feeling, I sense, that this might be the last truck coming, particularly in the north, where supplies were short of anything one would call acceptable levels. So despair drives many factors. But in the vacuum as well, when there is no law and order provided by any structured force, criminal gangs, availability of guns, weapons, a show of force. And here again, the strongest or most organized entity sort of tends to rise above. Who are the victims? Those that have no means, women and children, the ones who tend to be already vulnerable, they can never reach. And it has a very distortive, damaging effect, and it's a further negative spiral. But the concern is that this holds. This is also why in the Security Council yesterday, but on many other occasions, the Secretary General or myself and others have called for the return of the Palestinian Authority and, of course, the re-establishment of governance. And under governance, law and order, security, stability is extremely important, not only for the ability to provide aid, but also for people to receive it in a secure and safe manner. That it's not the law of the jungle, but you are entitled to be assisted in a manner that provides for human dignity and respect for the human being.
So there are lots of things I want to ask you. I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure we have time for the audience to also ask their questions. I do want to talk a little bit about the Maritime Route, though. That's just something that has received attention here. There was recently a Pentagon spokesman saying that U.S. military vessels are in the Mediterranean region and they're standing by, prepared to begin construction on the temporary pier off the coast of Gaza when given the order to do so. Said the U.S. was positioned to begin construction very soon, in the near future. Tell us a little bit about what role that pier will play. Talk us through the mechanism of getting food through this maritime route. How will that work? Who are the different actors that are involved in that? And where does the pier fit into the broader sort of paradigm that you're laying down about related to access?
Well, maybe with the pier, well, the maritime route is part of a bigger picture of diversification of routes. But the priority remains what I always say on land, land, land. It's quicker, it's cheaper, it's more predictable, more sustainable. The maritime route, however, sort of evolved as an option as we had great difficulty to get the goods to Gaza by land, given a number of crossings remained closed until fairly recently. And it evolved as an option and an opportunity to provide for additional commodities to arrive in Gaza. Checked and verified in Cyprus, shipped, of course, to the port, which is sort of in the middle of Gaza, I would say, and where humanitarian actors can, from a safe zone, receive to distribute further across the Gaza Strip. It's certainly innovative. Would it be something one would do under other circumstances? Perhaps not, but it's a testimony to the collective will of the international community to find opportunities by any means to reach innocent civilians and to not only procure, but also provide the levels of assistance that they need. So I consider it additional. The port in future could also have a helpful function, if it stays, because the planning is sort of evolving each time, a helpful function when it comes to recovery and reconstruction materials for Gaza.
So looking at the questions, I want to raise something that you have indeed referenced a few times, the World Central Kitchen episode, in which some 7 team members of World Central Kitchen were accidentally killed by an Israeli airstrike. And the question is, what is the UN's position on mechanisms for protecting INGOs operating in Gaza? You talked a little bit about deconfliction and deconfliction channels, but can you talk a little bit more about what posture is being taken, how to ensure that aid workers are also safe and secure in the provision of assistance?
Yeah, but I think we have to sadly recognize that this conflict has extracted a very high toll also of casualties amongst humanitarian workers, more so than any other situation. Secondly, the need to protect and the ability to work safely for humanitarian workers that work for INGOs or NGOs is as important as that of the UN family. So for me, the whole discussion and negotiation around deconfliction needs to be applicable to the entire humanitarian community. There's no difference. What we do know, however, in Gaza, certainly when it comes to arrangements and follow-up, the INGOs are in an even more vulnerable position. So we need to make sure make sure that all agreements that will be reached or have to be reaffirmed apply to all. And that requires obviously a lot of joint planning. There is, in a country setting, always the humanitarian country team. The NGOs are members of that group, I would say, and there everything is discussed, negotiated together, so you have a firm, solid position as one voice on behalf of the humanitarian community.
So another question that's come up, and I think it's on the minds of many who watch Gaza closely, you and I chatted briefly before coming on stage about it, and that is your assessment, or that of the UN's, of what a Rafa operation would mean for the displaced Gazans that are now very much grouped in Rafa, in this southern part of Gaza. What are the implications of a significant incursion into Rafa in terms of the humanitarian consequences of that?
Well, I think we can hardly imagine what the consequences would be, but we fear a further worsening of an already profound crisis. We fear, of course, loss of lives, and the Secretary General, myself, we keep, of course, asking for the Rafah operation, the incursion, not to happen. We can only predict catastrophic impact on civilians. Gaza is not a place where one can hide. We've seen this time and time and time again in any conflict, and it's been most exposed this round. Our ability to assist people will also be further confined and constrained. We do not have any visibility on the type of operation. We understand from Israeli officials that they state repeatedly that it will happen. And obviously, as a UN, we cannot be aligned in preparation for an invasion or an incursion we would not like to see happen. At the same time, we need to assist people, and we need to be in a position to provide for protection and support.
So I want to pivot a little bit. Your title is Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator. So I think it is important in some of the time that we have to draw you out a little bit more on these sort of over-the-horizon challenges related to reconstruction. It's something I wanted to ask you. There's also a question from the audience related, so I'm going to try and put them together and just maybe have you talk a little bit about what that pivot looks like from kind of early recovery to eventual reconstruction. What role do you see regional actors playing, such as the UAE in particular, as one country that has expressed interest in engaging on this? And then the question from the audience, which I think is also related, is what are the options for expanding energy imports into Gaza to supply electricity and other infrastructure? So maybe even as we think about even immediate humanitarian need, how do we plan, or how does the UN plan and think about how those immediate responses can actually also have the seeds for eventual reconstruction and economic development?
Yeah. Well, I think we're all familiar with the fairly old discussion now on the nexus, moving from humanitarian into development. But often there's a period in between that can either be drawn out or very short. What perhaps we also need to look at in Gaza, before I link it to the political parameters, is what we can do in very localized settings if there is no fighting or almost no fighting, or localized conditions that allow for it, that we really start already with the rehabilitation, with the early recovery. My big ask of everyone when I speak is, do not ask Palestinian civilians in Gaza to wait for the conclusion of the two-state solution. However, for the international community, it's very important that there's, of course, the prospect of the two-state solution. Regional actors have also made it very clear, and a number of them are also stating that they're not in a position or willing to reinvest again without there being the political parameters, prospects of the two-state solution, because otherwise who would know what will happen next? The international community has invested many times in Gaza. If I speak with my former hat as a Dutch minister, can't do that of course, can't switch hats, but let's say in the past the Dutch have invested in Gaza port a number of times. Each time the port has been destroyed. Now taxpayers after a while grow a little bit wary in also a changing political environment to say, let's invest one more time. They understand the human need, they understand it from a human rights perspective, but the actual decision to provide for the massive investments needed over multiple years beg the question first of the political context. So that's one. Then you need a governance setting. For the UN and for many countries, the return of the Palestinian Authority and the functioning of credible Palestinian institutions is really, really important to provide for that environment in which investments can be made, you can see change and progress. But we need to plan from now. You know that a number of needs assessments have been made available. They give you a very daunting picture of the extent of the damage and the cost. And we need to be creative. We cannot go after this conflict or this setting now with the same old instruments that we applied for another setting, other situations, significantly less damage. So we need to rethink. I'm hopeful that once there is a ceasefire and the release of the hostages, because we should not forget their fate and obviously the deep insecurity and fears of their families, that there is a shift in the discussion. And that's also where I think we need to prepare for that pivot.
Yeah.
We need to sort of prepare towards it, so when the moment is there, we can actually have content-based discussions. What's needed? How shall we do it? Who will lead on it? The ideas are there. Perhaps some prospects of financing, and then we can start. But my fear would be that there may be a drawn-out situation of low-level conflict continuing, limited access, not yet clarity on the governance, and in that twilight zone, we still have a duty of care and we have an obligation.
Right.
So that is my sort of drive to look at it in that way. And I'm very mindful as a former minister also of all the considerations governments have. But my only metric is, do we assist people, civilians in Gaza, do we give them hope? Do we give something meaningful and tangible? Because this is not a situation of parole. People need to see change, they need to live change. They've gone through too much.
Indeed. I mean, part of me is tempted to ask a darker question about whether we're already in the day after. In other words, there is no day after. There is no ceasefire. We're sort of living that reality. But I'm not. I'm gonna actually try and draw you out even a little further on. Have you seen creative ideas out there on how to start thinking, even now, about ways in which interventions now can actually start to play a role in Gaza's future, one day down the road, reconstruction? One idea, certainly I've heard, is the rubble, of which there's quite a bit, could be used to create artificial islands or part of a port or islands off the coast. Are there some creative ideas that you've stumbled upon in your work that you could share with the audience?
Well, I think I'm not sure if all is creative. I think all is very solid. For instance, there are a number of architects that have phenomenal ideas as to how Gazan civilians could have totally different forms of housing, short term but also longer term. There are wonderful ideas around the preservation and restoration also of Gaza heritage. You know, because everybody has history and everybody has heritage. Then when it comes to learning, we need to use all the technology available, not being dependent on the restoration or rehabilitation of all the school buildings, because currently these are still used also by the IDPs. So how do you provide for using sort of the school in a tent type of typology? How do we get children to learn? So I would say across every sector, there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of drive, and it's a matter of planning it out, but hopefully making it come together, of course, as a somewhat comprehensive plan. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that the Palestinian Authority has also put forward its ideas and wants to obviously take a leadership role, as it should, in this whole discussion, but also the implementation or execution of the change that civilians in Gaza need to see. Now, I'll give you one anecdote, though, which is a program I really liked, and when I was Minister for International Cooperation, we financed it. It was called Gaza Geeks. This for young people that were playing with IT, selling products online, knowing that they would, in the 17 years of the siege, not be permitted, most of them, to leave Gaza, ever. But they were giving the IT skills, they were giving marketing skills, they were selling, they were supporting, all with the idea. Now, let's say in other countries, India, you have a highly skilled and educated population. Palestinians in Gaza are equally smart, and most of them have graduated. And they were working away. So I'd also like to see again where technology can be used to sort of create the different jobs out there for which you do not necessarily have to travel, although I hope that for them as well, but you can start. Can be very localized, but that the world can somehow still be open to you. And here I think we need to have technology. Last but not least, Palestinian entrepreneurs are, so many of them are highly successful, willing to put their money out there, this ultimately building their future country. And there's a Gaza industrial estate. It's just outside of Carney. There were many companies were there before. If you start to rebuild those and provide for the permits and the opportunity, Gazans can work there. Income can be generated. So we need to start with a number of exemplary initiatives that have worked, that have ownership, and have the investors. And then we need to start driving the change. Is it enough? No. But one needs to start somewhere, because if you look at the sheer levels of destruction, it's very easy to be very daunted. And the civilians of Gaza we need to support them. We don't have the luxury to say, God, this is daunting, this is complex. I believe we, as fellow human beings, we owe it to them.
I want to actually conclude our conversation on that very hopeful and important note. I think you have outlined and given us some really interesting creative things to think about in the midst of an incredibly difficult, even to use your word, catastrophic situation, that there's always space for hope and creative ideas. Please join me in thanking Sigrid Kaag for spending time with us this afternoon for this very rich and enlightened discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.